Hello, I'm Yoshio Washizu. About 10 years ago, I wrote a paper on critical reading of Masonic literature for AQC, Transactions of Quarter Coronati Lodge in London, England. This video presentation is a revised, updated version of that paper with new material added to it. We Freemasons are encouraged to make a daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. Information on Freemasonry is available from many sources today. For instance, Grand Lodge publications, books, periodicals, encyclopedias, audio and video tapes, CDs, DVDs, lodges of instruction, lodges of research, seminars, and study courses offered in some jurisdictions. In recent years, the internet has become one of the most important sources of information. There are numerous Masonic websites and lively discussions are going on in many Masonic forums. The problem is that the information available from all these sources is not always accurate or correct. In order to gain a sound Masonic knowledge and form a balanced view on a craft, it is essential to read widely. By so doing, we should hopefully be able to evaluate objectively what we read and draw well-reasoned conclusions. My aim here is to offer a few pointers on critical reading of Masonic literature for beginning students, with full awareness that no single style of reading is equally workable for everyone or suitable for all kinds of reading materials. Masonic information is abundantly available today, and Masonic misinformation is also in wide circulation. The type of misinformation we encounter includes, among others, simple factual errors, fanciful speculation of the origin of Freemasonry, far-fetched interpretation of Masonic terms, symbols, furniture, and ritual, unsubstantiated claims of famous people belonging to our fraternity and of the fraternity's connection with other groups and historical events, and unfounded attribution of various problems of the world to the fraternity. Erroneous information is often found in the writings of non-Masons, including anti-Masonic writers. Such writings range from inaccurate accounts and inadvertent misleading statements to ill-intended made-up stories. Misinformation is also seen in the writings of members of our fraternity as they fail to examine sufficient material, misinterpret available information, make exaggerated statements, draw illogical conclusions, include irrelevant or wrong information, or make some other errors. Brother Harry Carr says, and I quote, Masonic books in general are plentiful, but the works that can be honestly recommended to the general Masonic reader are all too scarce. So much has been written and published by the worthy brethren whose feet were planted firmly in the clouds. Of course, they meant well, but they were unable to resist the strong temptation to fill the numerous gaps in our history and especially in our prehistory with statements and theories which had no foundation in fact and which could not withstand even the most elementary test. Unquote. False and misleading information was in circulation in the 18th and 19th centuries as well. It was in the mid 19th century that some German Masonic students began scientific study of Freemasonry in a full-fledged manner. One of them was Dr. George Claus, who produced several important works in the 1840s and 1850s. Another prominent figure was J.G. Findle. The English edition of his book, The History of Freemasonry, is better known among English-speaking Masonic students. And this is the second edition of that book. It was in the 1880s that 9 English brethren got together and formed Quattro Coronati Lodge to promote Masonic research and disseminate research papers to the Masonic world. The lodge started meeting in 1886. The members advocated the scientific study and examination of Masonic subjects based on evidence. This school of Masonic student is called the authentic school, as against the imaginative or mythical school, whose members often use imaginations, unsubstantiated assumptions, and even far-fetched ideas instead of facts. The Lodge has been leading the field in Masonic research in the world since its foundation. The membership of this premier Lodge of Masonic Research has been by invitation only and limited to 40. That number has never been reached, though. A complete set of its annual transactions, AQC, a total of 122 volumes published so far, is an unparalleled storehouse of Masonic information. And this is volume 122 of AQC. What I like about AQC is that in addition to the papers presented in the lodge, comments by other brethren on those papers are included. For instance, additional information on the subjects discussed, opposing views, and corrections of statements made in the papers, together with the presenter's responses to such comments, thus making the transactions all the more valuable and also preventing those unsubstantiated and erroneous statements made from being accepted as truth by future readers. Other materials of interest to Masonic students are also included in the transactions. The Lodge has an attached body called Quattro Coronati Correspondence Circle, QCCC, which has several thousand members from most Masonic jurisdictions around the world. Any Master Mason in good standing belonging to lodges on the roll of the United Grand Lodge of England and those lodges whose Grand Lodges are recognized by UGLE may join. QCCC members receive a copy of AQC annually and may attend the lodge meetings and participate in the discussions. And information on QCCC is available at the website given at the bottom of the screen. In addition to AQC, there are a number of books on Freemasonry written by past and present members of this lodge. They include many Masonic classics and must-have books. In order to properly evaluate what we read, we should be able to think critically with an attitude of open-minded skepticism. Most attributes of a critical thinker cited by Sharon Ferret, author of Peak Performance, are applicable to a student of the authentic school of Masonic research. In her views, the critical thinker asks pertinent questions, assesses statements and arguments, and is able to admit a lack of understanding or information. And he has a sense of curiosity and is interested in finding new solutions. He is willing to examine beliefs, assumptions, and opinions and weigh them against facts. He listens carefully to others and suspends judgment until all facts have been gathered and considered. He looks for evidence to support assumptions and beliefs and is able to adjust opinions when new facts are found. He looks for proof and is able to reject information that is incorrect or irrelevant. There are several factors we might check when reading Masonic writings. One of them is the author's qualifications. The following questions may be asked. What kind of credentials does he have? What is his background? What is his reputation for scholastic work in Masonic circles? If he has written any other books or articles, how are they accepted by established Masonic scholars? In the case of articles, where have they been published? In respected journals that require certain standards? Are those works good enough to qualify him as a credible author? The author must have some purpose in writing the paper or book, and there are several points to check. What is he trying to prove? What are his main points? Are all key terms clearly defined? What are his assumptions? We might also check the references provided to see the range of the author's sources. Personally, I believe that it is important that full references be provided for all key citations unless they are common knowledge, particularly in the case of research papers and other works of a similar nature. From the reader's standpoint, the references are useful only when the source information is given in full so that he will know where he can find the source if he wants to pursue the subject further. Next comes the analysis of his reasoning. What evidence does he offer to prove his points? We should judge the author's work on the basis of the evidence presented instead of simply accepting claims made at face value. As to the appropriateness of the evidence, the following factors may be considered among others: relevance, accuracy, objectivity, reliability, representativeness, and up-to-dateness. Relevance. No matter how accurate, objective, reliable, and representative the evidence may be, it is of little use unless it is relevant to the subject under discussion. Accuracy. Is the evidence accurate? Each piece of evidence and source should be cross-checked and compared with other related sources and evidence. And it is also important to see if the claim made by the author is based on the fact or his or someone else's opinion or assumption. Objectivity. Objectivity in writing is another important factor, and we should ask, is the author being objective or biased? Barbara Doyle, developmental reading expert, lists the following elements as characteristics of biased writing: emotional words or inflammatory statements, contradictions, false assumptions, stereotyping or overgeneralization, statements that oversimplify or distort the issue being discussed, and irrelevant or unsupported evidence. The author is also biased when he leaves out or suppresses information or evidence and appeals to the emotions rather than reasonable evidence. One of the most famous, or rather infamous, anti-Masonic books published in England in 1980s is Stephen Knight's The Brotherhood, containing various elements mentioned here. It is the epitome of biased writing. For instance, he says that the sovereign grand commander of the ancient and accepted right is, quote, truly Britain's highest Freemason, whatever might be said of the Duke of Kent, the current Grand Master of craft masonry, unquote. Needless to say, this is not true. As Brother Keith Jackson says in his book, Beyond the Craft, quote, that which can produce the oldest authentic records must naturally be the senior and highest, and this, of course, is the craft, end of quote. The ancient and accepted right which came into being much later than craft masonry, is one of Masonic appendant bodies. And appendant bodies have no authority over the craft. Still, anti-Masonic writers often make the same kind of allegations as Mr. Knight. Those works written by biased authors tend to contain cheap and often commercially exploiting sensationalism and appeal to uncritical readers. When we detect any of these elements mentioned here or something similar in what we read, we should question the author's credibility. Now, let me cite a case of overgeneralization and oversimplification. It's about a widely spread theory of Masonic history. I will comment on it only briefly as my presentation here is not on that subject. We don't know for sure exactly when or how Freemasonry got started, but this is what I was told many years ago. Freemasonry is descended from stonemasons of the Middle Ages in Europe. As business conditions began to deteriorate, they started accepting non-operatives as members. In the course of time, those non-operatives came to outnumber the stonemasons or operatives, and eventually operative lodges transformed into non-operative or speculative lodges. This operative to speculative transition theory is still widely believed, but is that how it got started? From various evidence, we can safely say that Freemasonry originates in the British Isles. However, it did not emerge in the same manner throughout the region. First, let me talk about Scotland. Among those operative lodges that existed in Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries was the Lodge of Edinburgh, the minutes of which date back to July 1599. And 35 years later, in July 1634, three noblemen were admitted to this operative lodge as recorded in its minutes. This was the first case of non-operatives becoming its members. It is not clear why or how they joined the lodge. Did they become its members to receive Masonic teachings? It is doubtful, because it was in the second half of the 18th century that moral teachings and symbolism began to be incorporated into Masonic ritual in full. So they couldn't possibly have become its members to learn Masonic teachings. Besides, their lodge attendance was not that frequent. So chances are they joined the lodge as honorary members. Subsequently, more non-operatives gradually became members of this and other operative lodges. The transition of Scottish lodges from operative to speculative was a very slow process. By 1717, when the first Grand Lodge was founded in England, there were at least 20 lodges in Scotland, and they were still all operative lodges except a lodge at Harford. This lodge at Harford, which existed from 1702 to 1764, is unique in that it was a non-operative lodge from the beginning. There's an excellent book on this book by my good and esteemed friend, Brother Trevor Stewart. And this is the book. This book is a rework of Harry Carr's Memorials of the Harford Lodge, with Carr's papers completely re-edited, reformatted, and amalgamated to form a continuous sequence, and other improvements have been made. Brother Stewart has done a thorough and meticulous job in producing this work as usual. So other Scottish lodges were still operative in the early 18th century. They had non-operatives among their members by then, but operative members still controlled the operation of most of those lodges in Scotland. It took the Lodge of Edinburgh a whole century before it became speculative. The number of operative entered apprentices admitted to this lodge between 1688 and 1721 was still much larger than that of non-operative EAs. That is, 118 operative EAs as against 28 non-operative EAs. And it was only toward the end of the 1730s that the lodge lost operative features and acquired the characteristics of speculative masonry. As to Lodge Mother Kilwinning, it was in the 1670s that it began to admit non-operatives. That is, some 40 years after the Lodge of Edinburgh did. So the transition process in Scottish operative lodges went very slow. On the other hand, there's no evidence of non-operatives having belonged to operative lodges in England in the 17th century. Actually, there's no evidence for operative lodges in England in the 17th century, not to my knowledge. It is true that the Masons Company of London had an inner circle known as the exception, to which both operatives and non-operatives were admitted in the 17th century. But the non-operatives or gentlemen were not joining the Masons Company. Therefore, it's a moot question whether this can be considered a proof of transition from operative to speculative in England. Moreover, speculative masonry was already active in England in the first half of the 17th century, as clear from Elias Ashmole's diary, dated October 16, 1646, when he was made a Freemason at Warrington, Lancashire. That is, long before Scottish operative lodges turned speculative. We have no details about his lodge because it was presumably an occasional lodge which was held in those days when its members wanted to meet, for instance, to make a new member and not on a regular basis. Anyway, there's a marked difference between Scotland and England as to the manner in which Freemasonry came into being. And under such circumstances, I find it hard to subscribe to the transition theory as far as English Freemasonry is concerned. Next point, reliability. Masonic writers use a variety of sources. Source materials can be usually categorized into one of three types: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary sources are raw, original, uninterpreted materials or direct evidence concerning a subject or event, and they are highly important to the study of historical events. The following questions might be asked to examine the quality of the primary sources. Who recorded the event and why? Did the recorder have first-hand knowledge of the event? Or did the recorder report what others witnessed? Did the recorder have any particular views or opinions that might have influenced the recording? And when was the information recorded? During the event, immediately after the event, or after some lapse of time? For Freemasons, the primary sources would be Grand Lodge records, lodge records, letters, diaries, memoirs, autobiographies, speeches, newspaper articles, and so on. Secondary sources are materials written about the event with the benefit of hindsight. They interpret, analyze, or restate primary sources, and they are useful in that they provide interpretation, overview, commentary, and so on, as long as the authors are on the right track. They include books, articles, dissertations, newspaper stories, dictionaries, encyclopedias, reference books, treatises, and so on. Tertiary sources compile, analyze, and digest primary and secondary sources. One of my main areas of interest in Masonic research is history of Freemasonry in the British Isles, as the Masonic fraternity as we know it studied in that region, although I have written on some other subjects also. So I have books on all the lodges, including those of English lodges that came into being in the formative years of the Premier Grand Lodge in the 1720s and 1730s. Most of these old lodge books include early minutes, descriptions of important events that took place in those days, other interesting accounts, facsimiles of old documents, pictures of paraphernalia, and so on. Then there are Masonic periodicals published in the mid-19th century. For instance, Freemason's Quarterly Review. This is the first volume of the Freemasons' Quarterly Review, published in 1834. And, let's see, Freemasons' Quarterly Magazine and Review, the first volume, published in 1850. And Freemasons' Monthly Magazine, first volume, published in 1855. And this is a large-sized Masonic periodical. The Freemasons Magazine and Masonic Mirror, Volume 1, 1859. From these publications, we can get some ideas as to what was going on Masonically and otherwise in those days. Being human, we are bound to err. Top-notch Masonic scholars are no exception. Brother Robert Gould, a founding member of Quarter Coronati Lodge and one of the greatest among the early Masonic historians of the authentic school, wrote several important books. The first book was The Four Old Lodges, which records the progress of craft in England and gives the history of all the lodges on the roll of the Premier Grand Lodge down to the Union of 1813. And then the Athol Lodges. This is an authentic history of those lodges that operated under the ancient Grand Lodge. And then he came up with military lodges 1732 to 1899. This is another important book containing many interesting and noteworthy accounts. And his magnum opus, The History of Freemasonry, mine is a 6-volume set. This is still a standard reference work for Masonic students today. And its condensed single-volume work is the concise history of Freemasonry. In addition, Brother Gould contributed many papers to AQC and other Masonic journals. They are all valuable to Masonic students. Still, he made some errors. For instance, it is a well-known fact that he held to the idea of the ancient Grand Lodge having developed from a schism in the Premier Grand Lodge, even after the publication of Brother Henry Sadler's notable work, Masonic Facts and Fictions. Brother Sadler ably presented his theory that the ancient Grand Lodge was created by a group of unattached Masons of Irish origin. Brother Frederick Crowe, who revised Gould's Concise History of Freemasonry, wrote in the preface to the revised edition, and I quote, "The principal change I have made is to rewrite the first part of Chapter 7, that is the Great Division in English Masonry. Since Mr. Sadler made his most valuable researches in the archives of Grand Lodge and elsewhere, it has become clear to all students of our history that his view of the Irish origin of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients is the correct one, and I feel sure I shall be supported by all lovers of truth in the changes I have made." End of quote. The Aquarium Press reprinted several important Masonic classics in the mid-1980s, and Brother John Hummel was senior editor. Sadler's Masonic Facts and Fictions was one of them. And in the preface to this reprint, Brother Hummel says, and I quote, "Masonic Facts and Fictions is a seminal work in the historiography of English Freemasonry. Although Sadler subtitled his work A New Theory of the Origin of the Ancient Grand Lodge, so persuasive is his critical examination of the evidence that few, if any, today would question his conclusion that the ancient Grand Lodge did not develop from a schism in the Premier Grand Lodge, but had its beginnings in a group of unattached Masons of Irish origin, who rejected the alterations that the Premier Grand Lodge had made in that ritual as a result of the exposures of the late 1720s and particularly Preacher's Masonry dissected of 1730. So acceptable has Sadler's theory become that it seems odd to present-day Masonic historians that the schism theory could ever have been accepted as other than a propaganda exercise by members of the Premier Grand Lodge to discredit its junior rival. We forget, though, how bitter could be the rivalry between the two bodies and how much the Premier Grand Lodge resented both the existence and the popularity of its rival, particularly its close ties with the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland and the predominance of its lodges in North America. End of quote. Brother Hummel, a professional Masonic historian himself, whom I respect most highly, comments on Brother Sadler's works as follows. As a Masonic historian, Sadler was meticulous in his attention to detail and scrupulous in his attention to factual truth. His painstaking research is apparent in his two major works, the present reprint and his Thomas Dunkaway, his life, labors, and letters, 1891. Both works, despite their age, still stand as landmarks in the historiography of English Freemasonry and are perfect examples of the scientific approach to Masonic history. In both works, Sadler lays all the ascertainable facts and evidence before his readers, reproducing all his evidence at length, microscopically examining each piece, and building up his case from that critical examination. He begins with no preconceived ideas and he simply lets the evidence speak for itself. And unlike his predecessors, he clearly states what is fact and what is his interpretation of those facts, assiduously pointing out that he is developing a theory that may be open to argument. I have some other books by Sadler, Memorials of the Globe Lodge number 23, Illustrated History of the Emulation Lodge of Improvement, and notes on the ceremony of installation. And all these books by him epitomize the kind of work true Masonic historians of the authentic school produce. No doubt, Brother Bernard E. Jones' Freemason's Guide and Compendium is one of the best books on Freemasonry published in the English language. However, some erroneous and unsubstantiated statements are found in it. For instance, he says, and I quote, Mary's Chapel Lodge of Edinburgh had admitted a gentleman honorary member about 40 years before the date of Murray's admission. That is 1641. He was John of the famous Boswell family of Auchinleck. End of quote. Brother Harry Haywood, one of the most prolific Masonic writers in the United States of the last century, says in his Symbolical Masonry, and I quote, a certain Boswell was initiated as a speculative Mason in Scotland in 1598, the first event of such a character in the records of Masonry, end of quote. Evidently, both of them are referring to John Boswell, Laird of Auchinleck, but their statements are not supported with hard evidence. The only primary source of information available about Boswell is the minutes of the Lodge of Edinburgh, dated June 8, 1600, at the bottom of which are found his name and mark, nothing more, nothing less. From this record, it is not clear in what capacity he was in attendance. It was not an ordinary Masonic meeting, but a trial of its warden, John Brown. Some brothers, like Brother Jones, believe that Boswell was there as a member or an honorary member of the lodge, and that this is the first evidence of a non-operative Mason being present at an operative lodge's meeting. And some others, like Brother Haywood, claim that Boswell was initiated in 1598 or 1600 or something like that. Still, some others cite the possibility of his having been there as counsel for prosecution or defense or for some other reason. At any rate, the meeting of June 8, 1600 is the only occasion to which Boswell's connection with the craft can be traced. Here's another example of unsubstantiated statement. The Grand Lodge of Ireland was founded in 1725. The fact is that no record has been discovered concerning its foundation. We know that it was in existence in 1725 from an account of the Dublin Weekly Journal of June 26, 1725. The 700-word plus account given in 3 paragraphs on this page is about a gathering of Irish brethren for the election and installation of a new Grand Master. Next point, representativeness. One swallow does not make a summer. Likewise, a few incidents cannot necessarily be considered as representative of the whole. A case in point are the two operative lodges that emerged in England at the beginning of the 18th century, one at Alnwick in Northumberland and the other at Swalwell in County Durham. Closely located to Scotland, they were probably influenced by the Scottish practice. So the emergence of these operative lodges in England cannot be interpreted to support the operative to speculative transition theory in England. Next point, up-to-dateness. There are Masonic classics which are often used as secondary sources today. New material may have become available, or new theories may have been introduced since they were originally published. So we might ask, when was the work cited published? Is the information provided up to date? Normally, the newer the edition, the better. However, not all revised editions are better than previous editions. Here are some other pointers: depth and breadth. We should see if the subject is dealt with as thoroughly as it should. If the subject is a complex one, it should be examined from various angles. Does the author address the issue in a comprehensive manner, from the opposing viewpoints as well? One of the archaic words used in Freemasonry is heal or hail. Disputes still arise from time to time about the word, especially its pronunciation. Some say it should be pronounced heal to rhyme with meal, while others say it should be pronounced hail to rhyme with male. Most Masonic reference books touch on this word, but all in all, the explanation is briefly given in a single sentence to a few paragraphs, and most fail to tell the reader why the word should be pronounced the way suggested. So, I wrote a paper on this subject entitled Notes on Heal. It incorporates the following points. Definition of the word found in old dictionaries such as Saxon Latin English Dictionary of 1659, Light Saxon Dictionary of 1772, and the Oxford English Dictionary, the most authoritative English dictionary based on historical principles, and the word's usage in early Masonic documents. I also touch on the transformation of the English language, including what is called great vowel shift, and the use of rhymes in English literature in the early days. I cite Chaucer's works in which the word heal is used with some other words that rhyme with it. I also include the pronunciation of the word used in the days of and after the Union of 1813, the question and answer about its pronunciation, which appeared in the Freemasons magazine and Masonic Mirror in the mid-19th century, its spelling and pronunciation used in different parts of England, as recorded in Wright's English Dialect Dictionary, published more than 100 years ago, its pronunciation used in two old established lodges of instruction in England, and the subject of word pairs. So it is quite extensive in scope. Its electronic version is found at the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon's website. The web page is given at the bottom of the screen. Historical context. When we read books and articles, we tend to judge them on the basis of our own knowledge and experience. It should be remembered that people's customs, values, and attitudes often change in the course of time. This point is particularly important when we read Masonic histories. Things were quite different a couple of centuries ago from what they are today. For example, some think that Freemasons of yesteryear were, as a whole, a bunch of uncouth drunkards. Indeed, heavy drinking was very popular and considered an indispensable accompaniment to good fellowship in England in the 18th century. According to a report made by the magistrates of Middlesex in 1725, in the metropolis alone, there were over 6,000 houses and shops where gin and other spirits were sold, and in the largest parish, this amounted to one in every 5 houses. People were less refined in their manners and tended to be more quarrelsome. Ladies of even the highest social status were quite accustomed to expectorate and swear loudly in public. Under such circumstances, the brethren were not immune from the common customs of their times. Therefore, if we are to judge them, we should do so by the standards of their times, not ours. It is true that turbulence, inebriety, and irregularity were observed in some lodges, but such should not be considered common occurrences in view of the large number of lodges that were in existence then. In fact, Freemasonry exercised a salutary moral and social influence, with most members conforming to the rules of conduct in an age which was quite different from ours. Next, I would like to talk about symbolism. Freemasonry is said to be a peculiar system or beautiful system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. Symbolism is used throughout the ritual to teach Masonic philosophy and moral lessons. By conducting a balanced study of symbolism, we can cultivate our mind, develop a deeper appreciation of the ritual, and find Freemasonry more meaningful. When used properly, it makes an effective means of instruction, but it can be abused. There are those who get carried away, putting an esoteric meaning to every part of the ritual, and others who attach a symbolical meaning to anything Masonic. Masonic ritual has evolved over the years, and it was crude and simple in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. While some symbolism is found in the early catechisms, it is not until the second half of the 18th century that the ritual became more elaborate, with symbolic attributions together with moral lessons added to it. So, one thing to ask when interpreting Masonic symbolism is, could it be within the intent of the compilers of our ritual? Brother Hammond says, and I quote, over-enthusiastic members will impose upon Freemasonry highly idiosyncratic interpretations not intended by the originators and achieved by taking similarities between Masonic symbolism and symbolism in other fields to be actual correlations and evidence of actual links, interpretations that are alien to most members and at times distasteful to them. And here's what Brother Carr says, and I quote, I must still put on record a deep-rooted dislike for aberrations in symbolism, extremes of interpretation which have no justification in the symbol itself and only mislead the reader or succeed in bemusing him. Some time ago, a paper on the meaning of Masonry was submitted to me for criticism. The writer was clearly a teetotaler with strong views on the drink question, and in two separate pieces of interpretation of Masonic ritual, he showed that they meant, respectively, the virtues of teetotalism and the evils of drink. He was probably astonished when I pointed out that he was not giving an interpretation of Masonry, but of himself. Similarly, I'm convinced that real damage is done by those inveterate symbolists who need the dimensions of pyramids, the mysteries of heavenly bodies, the tarot cards, the zodiac, and other equally complex paths towards truth. End of quote. Interpretation of symbolism can be highly subjective, and there are those who push their personal interpretations based on their fertile imagination as if they were absolute truth. We should watch out for such symbolists and their writings. There are lots of them out there. Brother Wallace McLeod calls them mystical nuts and counts such writers as Foster Bailey, Albert Churchward, Manly Hall, A.E. Waite, and Arthur Ward among them. His advice: avoid them like the plague. Brother Ross Hepburn even recommends that, as far as newly made Masons are concerned, the symbolism be left alone until they have acquired a reasonable amount of Masonic background, because many Masonic writers with no qualifications except membership of the craft have regarded themselves as authorities on Masonic symbolism, and those brethren with more enthusiasm than knowledge have written a great deal of nonsense about the subject. All this is misleading to new Masons, and much of it has provided ammunition for our enemies. Lastly, let me quote Brother William Harry Rylance, a founding member of Quatuor Coronati Lodge. And I quote, "Symbolism is always a difficult affair, as everyone knows, or at least ought to know. When once fairly launched on the subject, it often becomes an avalanche or torrent which may carry one away into the open sea or more than empty space. On very few questions has more rubbish been written than that of symbols and symbolism. It is a happy hunting ground for those who, guided by no sort of system or rule, ruled only by their own sweet will, love to allow their fancies and imaginations to run wild. Interpretations are given which have no other foundation than the disordered brain of the writer. And when proof or anything approaching a definite statement is required, symbols are confused with metaphors, and we are involved in a further maze of follies and wilder fancies which bring to mind a certain theological study advanced as unanswerable. That the word curtail is derived from the fact that the tails of curs are always cut short. One question enters very deeply into the matter: what symbols or symbolism have we in Freemasonry which stand out as having an undoubted pedigree from a respectable antiquity? I venture to think that very little of the complicated symbolism now in use could be proved, even with a fair amount of probability, to have existed beyond modern times. Freemasonry at the present time possesses, it must be admitted, if writers on the subject are to be credited, a hodgepodge of symbols and the attendant symbolism gleaned from every available source. How much of this, I wonder, can fairly be traced to the operative and speculative Masons who lived long before the Grand Lodge of 1716, 1717. End of quote. In their excellent book, The Genesis of Freemasonry, Douglas Knoop and G.P. Jones say, and I quote, "So far as we are aware, there is no evidence whatsoever that operative Masons ever moralized upon their working tools, or that accepted or speculative Masons did so prior to the 18th century." End of quote. So I strongly recommend that we use good judgment and discrimination when it comes to Masonic symbolism. Now, we may ask the following questions to determine whether the author has proved his points. Has he addressed all key questions? Are his arguments consistent and logical? Has he provided sufficient evidence for his arguments? Has he dealt with alternative evidence or arguments, if any? Has he quoted others' arguments accurately? Are there any points that are vague, confusing, oversimplified, contradictory, false, wrong, or irrelevant in his arguments? Are his conclusions reasonable and justified? Has his work lived up to our expectations? By the way, I referred to the authentic school and the imaginative and mythical school earlier. George Oliver was a voluminous writer of the 19th century in England, producing lots of books on Freemasonry. But he tended to be fanciful and uncritical when writing many of his books, that is, in his interpretations of various Masonic subjects, particularly Masonic symbolism. The historical landmarks of Freemasonry, written by him, is a good example. As I am interested in the subject of ancient landmarks, I obtained this two-volume set. While some people value this exhaustive work, I don't think much of it, because it is full of unreliable information and far-fetched ideas. As a whole, I have little interest in the works of writers of the mythical school, so I don't have many of his books. Another subject I am interested in is Masonic jurisprudence. And when I do the research on Masonic subjects, I often examine them from a historical perspective. So I have several books on Masonic jurisprudence published in the United States in the mid-19th century, like these. How about England? There's a book entitled Institutes of Masonic Jurisprudence, published in London in the mid-19th century, in 1859 to be exact. It is written by George Oliver. It is an exemplification of English Book of Constitutions digested under appropriate heads. And I find this book by Oliver very informative and useful. There's another book of his that I have and I like. The Book of the Lodge. This is the second edition, published in 1856. And there's a third edition. This third edition is substantially expanded and published in 1864. And this is a reprint edition made available by the Aquarium Press in 1986. And I like this book also, although it contains some unsubstantiated information. Brother George Oliver is often labeled as a writer of the imaginative or mythical school, but he wrote non-fiction kind of books also. And although I'm not keen on getting books on Masonic symbolism and some other subjects by him, I am deeply appreciative of the latter kind of books by him, such as this book I just mentioned. In this presentation, I have referred to several old books and other publications, and some of them are original editions and the others are reprints. As a whole, those original editions are not readily available, but some of them are offered in the form of reprints or PDF format. From time to time, I am asked by some brethren to recommend Masonic books. So for this presentation, I have made a list of 10 titles which I would recommend to beginning students. The list will be found at the end of this video. Before concluding this presentation, I wish to say one more thing. The pointers mentioned in this presentation for critical reading may also be used when we do the writing ourselves. As we become more skilled in critical reading, we are likely to become more sensitive to our own writing. By applying such critical skills to our own work, we can improve our writing, and we should be the strongest critic of our own work. And as we improve our evaluation skills, we will become a better reader, writer, and observer. Conclusions. So, there are lots of things for us to learn to become a well-informed Freemason. To get the most from what we read and acquire the right kind of knowledge, we might consider the use of critical reading. Interested viewers might formulate their own reading style by adopting whatever ideas they may find useful in this presentation and adding any other steps to suit their needs. And I hope that they will enhance their learning experience, expand their Masonic knowledge, and deepen their interest in our fraternity by reading widely and judiciously.